March 15th, 1939, Prague. Snow is falling, and so is a country. German tanks are rolling through the streets and nobody is shooting back. No battle, no resistance, just silence and the sound of steel treads on cobblestone. By nightfall, Hitler is sleeping inside Prague Castle. By morning, Czechoslovakia, a nation that fought for its independence just 20 years earlier, no longer exists. Standing in that silent crowd is a man who 5 months earlier got down on his knees and begged his own president to go to war rather than surrender. A decorated war hero, a famous writer, a man who once said a country too cowardly to defend itself has no right to speak of honor. Within 3 years, that same man designs his own Nazi-style uniform, goes on the radio every week, not to fight the occupation but to sell it, and becomes the most hated man in Czech history. Stick around, because by the end of this video, you will understand exactly how a war hero becomes a traitor. And it happens faster and darker than you think. If stories about betrayal, collapse and the darkest choices of World War II hit different for you, hit subscribe right now. Because what this man does next is not just collaboration, it is one of the most disturbing turns in the entire war. Let us go back to where it all began. Emanuel Moravec was born on April the 17th, 1893 in Prague, then still part of the vast and crumbling Austro-Hungarian Empire. His family ran a small shop. There was nothing about this boy that predicted the storm he would one day become. He trained as a clerk, took an ordinary job at an ordinary company, and lived the kind of quiet life millions of young men in Europe were living before everything changed. Then, in the summer of 1914, an archduke was assassinated in Sarajevo, and the entire continent was dragged into war. Moravec was drafted into the Austro-Hungarian army and shipped straight to the front. In 1915, the Russians captured him and sent him thousands of miles away to a prisoner of war camp near Samarkand in what is today Uzbekistan. Most men in that position simply wait out the war behind barbed wire, counting the days until it ends. Moravec did not wait. He volunteered to fight against the very empire that had drafted him, taking command of a machine gun unit inside the 1st Serbian Volunteer Division, a brutal fighting force built entirely from former prisoners who switched sides to join the Allies. In 1916, on the blood-soaked Dobruja front against Bulgarian forces, he was wounded and hospitalized. He recovered, and instead of going home, he joined something even bigger, the Czechoslovak Legion, an army of exiles fighting not for an empire, but for a dream that did not exist on any map yet, an independent Czechoslovakia. To secure the officer's commission he desperately wanted, Moravec lied and claimed he held an engineering degree he did not actually have. It worked, and it was the first sign of something we will see again and again throughout this man's life. He was willing to bend the truth completely to get exactly what he wanted. While still stranded in revolution-torn Russia, at 27 years old, Moravec married a 17-year-old Russian woman who was already pregnant with his child. It was the beginning of a pattern of relationships with much younger women that would follow him for the rest of his life. But his real story, the one that defines him, has not even started yet. Back in the newly formed Czechoslovak Republic, Moravec's military career exploded. He served as an intelligence officer, enrolled at the prestigious War College in Prague, and was promoted to major by age 30, before he had even finished his officer training. That is how talented he was. But cracks were already forming beneath the surface. In 1926, an internal audit of his department uncovered serious financial irregularities, and he was quietly transferred out, reassigned to command a field battalion in a small town far from the capital. It was around this same period that his personal life began spiraling out of control too, ending in a divorce, followed almost immediately by a marriage to an 18-year-old girl, when Moravec himself was already 39. But here is what makes Moravec genuinely dangerous and genuinely tragic. He was brilliant, and for years he was completely right. Writing under a pen name, Moravec became one of the country's most widely read military analysts, warning again and again that Nazi Germany was coming for Czechoslovakia, whether the world wanted to believe it or not. He argued that the Bohemian lands were a natural fortress guarding the heart of Europe. He demanded rearmament. He demanded alliances with Poland and Italy before it was too late. He predicted almost everything that was about to happen to his country, years before it happened. President Tomáš Masaryk, the founding father of Czechoslovakia, trusted him completely, and when Masaryk died in 1937, it was Moravec who led the military funeral procession through the streets of Prague. By every measure available at the time, this man was one of the most respected patriots in the entire country. So, what turns a national hero into a national traitor? It only took one single night to break him completely. September 1938. Hitler is demanding the Sudetenland, the fortified borderland that stands between his army and the rest of Czechoslovakia. War is one wrong move away from consuming Europe. Moravec forces his way into a private meeting with President Edvard Beneš. For 2 hours, he begs, practically on his knees, for his country to fight rather than surrender. The Czechoslovak army is mobilized. The fortifications are manned and ready. Beneš says no. He accepts Hitler's demands without firing a single shot, abandoned by Britain and France, two allies who chose appeasement over the risk of another world war. And something inside Emanuel Moravec does not simply break that night. It rots from the inside out. He compares his own government surrendering its ideals to a prostitute who has no right to boast about her honor. In disgust, he tries to quit the army entirely, requesting permission to go fight for the army of El Salvador instead, anywhere in the world but here. He is stripped of his teaching post and formally banned from writing, his years of warnings about Germany now considered too provocative to print. And 6 months later, Hitler finishes the job anyway. Prague falls completely, and the country Moravec spent a decade trying to save simply ceases to exist. At this exact point, you would expect this story to end quietly, with a broken patriot silenced, forced to watch his country die from the shadows. But this is actually where the real story begins, and what happens next will genuinely disgust you. Moravec has every reason to fear the Nazis occupying his homeland. His name is known across Germany as a fierce and vocal enemy of the Reich, someone who spent years publicly warning about exactly this outcome. Instead, the new authorities tell him something unexpected. He can write again. And Emanuel Moravec, the same man who once begged his own president to go to war, picks up his pen and blames the victims. Not Hitler, not Germany. He blames his own government, his own intellectuals, for lacking the courage to fight back when it mattered most. Within months, he is broadcasting Nazi propaganda across the airwaves. Every single week, lending his considerable talent as a writer and speaker entirely to the occupiers' cause. Then, in the autumn of 1941, Reinhard Heydrich, one of the chief architects of the Holocaust, arrives in Prague as the new acting Reich protector. Heydrich needs a Czech face that the public still trusts, someone credible enough to sell submission convincingly. He picks Moravec. In January 1942, over the objections of the protectorate's own puppet president, Heydrich personally forces through Moravec's appointment as Minister of Education and National Enlightenment, formally pardoning every single anti-German article he had ever written. That same year, Moravec founds and personally chairs a fascist youth organization designed specifically to indoctrinate an entire generation of Czech children into loyalty towards the Reich. He publicly declares that Czech universities already closed since 1939, do not need to reopen at all. He makes German a mandatory subject in every school. He preaches, openly and repeatedly, that Czech culture is nothing more than a branch of the greater Germanic world. And then he does something almost unbelievable for a man who once wept over his country's lost freedom. He personally designs his own ministerial uniform, a twisted hybrid of Czech military dress fused with SS styling, and he wears it constantly with visible and unmistakable pride. By as early as 1940, Czech resistance fighters are already discussing how to kill him. The Czechoslovak government in exile, operating out of London, puts his assassination formally on the table. That is how quickly and how completely his own people turned against him. Then, in May 1942, Czechoslovak commandos trained in Britain ambush and mortally wound Heydrich in the streets of Prague. The Nazi response is one of the most horrifying acts of collective revenge in the entire war. Entire villages erased from the map, thousands of innocent civilians executed in retaliation. And where exactly is Emanuel Moravec during this bloodbath? Standing on a stage, in front of his own terrified countrymen, publicly calling the assassins criminals and demanding absolute loyalty toward the very regime currently slaughtering their neighbors in the streets. In 1943, he goes even further, formally proposing to send the entire Czech government army to die fighting for Germany on the Eastern Front, a plan so extreme that even hardline Nazi officials in Prague refuse to bring it before Hitler. He publicly embraces Nazi anti-Semitism as well, openly blaming Jewish interests for the pre-war tensions between Czechs and Germans. There is no ambiguity left in who this man has become. The hero is completely gone. The writer, who once risked everything to warn his country about Nazi Germany, is now the very same voice defending the men who occupy it, the very same voice attacking the resistance fighters trying to free it. But his punishment is not coming from the Nazis who used him and who will eventually discard him anyway once he is no longer useful. It is coming from his own family, and it is absolutely brutal. Moravec married 3 times over the course of his life. With his first wife, he had 2 sons, Igor and Yuri. His eldest son, Igor, chose to follow his father's collaboration to its final horrifying conclusion, volunteering for the Waffen-SS and fighting on the Eastern Front with the notorious Totenkopf division. After the war ended in 1947, Igor was hanged in Prague for treason. His other son, Heydrich, also served in the German army, though he was privately critical of everything his father stood for. And Moravec's youngest son, Pavel, from his second marriage, the one who arguably had the least choice in any of this, was killed in an Allied air raid in 1944. One family, completely and utterly destroyed because one man chose collaboration over resistance, and within a matter of months, Emanuel Moravec is about to pay the final price himself. By the spring of 1945, even Moravec can see clearly that the war is lost. As the Red Army closes in from the east, he pivots his propaganda one final time, now desperately warning Czechs about the coming Bolshevik danger, hoping to rally a population that stopped trusting him years ago. Nobody is listening anymore. On May 5, 1945, the Prague Uprising erupts. The very same people Moravec spent 3 years telling to submit are now taking their capital back, block by block, street by street. 52 years old, Moravec climbs into a police truck outside his ministry, trying desperately to reach a meeting with the Nazi governor across the city. Insurgents open fire on the convoy almost instantly. The vehicles reroute, trying another path toward Prague Castle. And then, in the middle of the chaos, the car simply runs out of gas. The driver steps outside to find fuel, and in that final moment, alone, stranded, completely surrounded by the uprising of the people he spent years betraying, Emanuel Moravec draws his pistol and ends it himself. Here is what should genuinely stay with you after all of this. Moravec was not the only Czech broken by the humiliation of Munich in 1938. Thousands of others felt that exact same rage, that exact same shame. But they chose differently. They joined the resistance. They fled into exile and kept fighting from the outside. They died in Nazi camps rather than collaborate with the men who destroyed their homeland. Moravec chose something else entirely. The officer who once begged his country to fight became the voice that told his own people to lie down and accept their occupier. The patriot, who accurately predicted Hitler's ambitions for an entire decade, became one of Hitler's most useful and effective Czech instruments. This is not simply a story about disappointment or bitterness, or a man who lost one argument in 1938. It is a story about what happens when a person's pride curdles into something far darker, when the humiliation of being right and completely ignored becomes an excuse to burn down everything they once claimed to believe in. It is a warning about how easily a brilliant mind, wounded badly enough, can talk itself into betraying everyone who ever trusted it, and can convince an entire nation to follow along. Emanuel Moravec spent the first half of his life fighting to build a nation from nothing. He spent the second half of his life helping to systematically destroy it. If this story genuinely got under your skin, hit subscribe right now, smash that like button, and drop a comment telling me honestly, after Munich, would you have fought like the resistance did? Fled into exile, or broken completely the way Moravec did? Most people watching this like to believe they would have chosen resistance without hesitation. But history shows us again and again that ordinary people, under enough pressure and enough humiliation, are capable of choices they never thought possible. The War Files brings you the true stories that textbooks leave out, the collaborators, the traitors, and the impossible choices that defined history's darkest years. New episodes every single week. We will see you in the next one.